Good morning. We're passing out the outlines that were a little slow getting to Tommy this morning. I'll take the blame for that. I was doing some finishing touches on the outline before I said it. Now, one of the things I wanted to do is kind of close the loop on our look last week at the fall of man when Adam and Eve sinned against God. And I wanted you to know that, I promised that I would circle back to have some archaeological references once we got to the Old Testament. Well, there is a lot of archaeological evidence for the Tree of Life tradition. There's a lot of it. For example, Babylonians kept records of many things, and there are many references in Babylonian inscriptions to a tree of life from which man was driven under the influence of an evil spirit, with guardian cherubs preventing the return to the tree of life. And among these tablets, there's the story of Adapa, known as the Babylonian Adam. He was referred to as the seed of mankind, wise man of Eridu, blameless until he offended the gods. Through knowledge he became mortal, and food for life he ate not. He couldn't eat from the tree of life anymore. So we find this tradition among the Babylonians. Also, 2 seals have been found, and one of them is in the British Museum, and the other is in a museum in Philadelphia. The temptation seal depicts a tree in the center between a man on the right and a woman plucking fruit on the left. Behind the woman is a serpent standing erect, apparently whispering to her. The Adam and Eve seal is now in the University Museum in Philadelphia, about 3500 BC. They've dated it to 3500 BC. It shows a naked man and woman walking as if utterly downcast and brokenhearted, followed by a serpent. And I've seen pictures of both of these seals. I mean, they're just eerie. They look like they were taken from the third chapter of Genesis. It's amazing. And all ancient civilizations have similar traditions. Persians, Hindus, Greeks, Chinese, Mongolians, Tibetans. They all have similar ancient traditions. The original story of creation must have been told by Adam to Methuselah. Their lives overlapped. If you take a look at a timeline, we'll talk about Methuselah briefly in just a few minutes. But Adam must have told it to Methuselah, and Methuselah to Noah, because Noah and Methuselah's lives overlapped, and hence to Shem, the son of Noah. In the national cultures that followed, the story became variously and grossly modified, but they still have the same type of traditions, which are very similar to what we find in the book of Genesis. We're going to see when we look at the flood next week that these same civilizations also have flood traditions. It's not just here in the Old Testament where we find some of these ancient examples of God dealing with man. So let's move on to Cain and Abel. Now, this is an interesting chapter because of the lessons that it teaches, but it also raises some questions. It raises some questions. Now, we have no idea the time span between the last verse of chapter 3 and the first verse of chapter 4. There was a period there, right? And you'll remember when we were talking about creation, there are certain times when it appears as though there was a long lapse of time between one event and another, but it's not described. So is the case here. We have no idea how long a time went by between chapter 3 and chapter 4. So let's take a look at this. There's no record of the time span. There's also no record of the events that occurred during that time. I, of course, have opinions, and I'll share those with you in a minute. Now, there are very many lessons. There are many lessons in this chapter that have a direct bearing on the future, all the way up to the book of Revelation, which is interesting. I mean, we see here in the beginnings, God setting the stage for the things that were to come. And now we have the story of Cain and Abel, two brothers. The birth of Cain, in Hebrew, it's Cain, Q-A-Y-I-N. And that's the Hebrew word that sounds like the word in Hebrew, acquired. Eve was overjoyed at the birth of this son. She at last was able to bring forth a man. I think she had probably already had daughters. That's my opinion. That's my personal opinion. Because we don't know what happened between chapter 3 and chapter 4. Highly unlikely that this particular event where Adam lay with his wife Eve, or another translation says Adam made love to his wife Eve, highly unlikely that that was the first time. Highly unlikely, right? I mean, they've been married a long time. Highly unlikely. So I would suggest that she had already given birth to one or more daughters, and there's a little bit of evidence to that over in verse 17 when we find Cain has a wife. And the question is, where did he get his wife? And I heard an old preacher say one time, look, son, if you'd worry more about your wife instead of somebody else's wife, you'd get a lot better. You'd be a lot better off. Okay, but here's what Genesis 4:1 says. Adam made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, with the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man. I have brought forth, or have acquired, a man, hence his name. And then we have the birth of Abel, and the Hebrew for that is Hebel. And it sounds like the Hebrew word meaning a mist or vapor. And that's kind of prescient, isn't it? Because he died young. He was only here, such as a mist or a vapor, but no fanfare with the birth of Abel. I mean, Eve is exclaiming what a great deal it is that she has Cain, and then it says she also gave birth to Abel. You know? Wonder why. First children, first son, you know. In any case, it says, later she gave birth to Abel, his brother Abel. Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. They had two different professions. Cain worked the soil like his father did. Remember, God said to Adam, by the sweat of your brow, you're going to plant things, and the earth is going to be against you, and it's going to be tough for you to grow things. So Adam was a farmer. Abel, on the other hand, tended flocks. He kept flocks. What for? They didn't eat meat, so he didn't keep them for, they were vegetarians, right?
Sacrifice, I guess.
Eventually, sacrifice. Two things you can get from goats
Milk,
or sheep.
clothing,
Milk, furs. I mean, that's what their first clothing was made, wool. I mean, there are other products other than meat from flocks. But in any case, Abel was a herdsman and Cain a farmer. And it says in the course of time, we don't know how long between their birth and them growing up and becoming adults and getting jobs, how long did it take before they brought forth some of the fruits of the soil or brought forth two offerings? We don't know how much time it'll last. But it says in the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. Now that's important, the way it's described. Some of the fruits of the soil. Verse 4 says, but Abel brought fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. Fat portions, the choicest pieces from his firstborn. Set up the sacrificial system later on, But here we have Abel doing something, fat portions and firstborn. Cain just brought some of his fruits of the soil. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with bringing God an offering of fruits of the soil. There's not. We find that you have wave offerings, you have other kind of offerings in the law that include bringing some of the product of the land. It wasn't the type of offering. There was more to it than that, which we'll get to in just a second. So he says, the Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering. You catch that? He says he looked with favor on Abel as the individual and the offering. Not just the offering. He says, but on Cain and his offering, he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry and his face downcast. You know, we don't know how God expressed his displeasure with Cain and his offering. But it was obvious to Cain, however God manifested it, was obvious to Cain that God did not respect what he had brought. And he says, each man brought a gift to God, and there's no mention of a command to do so. They just did it. Right? It was evidently voluntary. I don't know why. I don't know what prompted them to do it, but it doesn't tell us. And there's no mention of an altar or a place of the religious observance. It doesn't say where it happened, how exactly it happened. But this is the first act of worship recorded in human history. Bringing an offering to God. Bringing an offering to God. I think that is almost the purest form of worship, isn't it? Bringing yourself to God. May we be living sacrifices, Paul tells us, to God. We bring ourselves, we dedicate ourselves to his service. That is part of the worship process. And so Abel and his offering were looked on with favor by God, but on Cain and his offering, God did not look with favor, and why not? Well, there's no reason given. God doesn't say why. And we don't know how God, like I said, indicated his disapproval. But I think the nature of the gifts and the givers were probably the reason. As I said, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil, but not necessarily the first or the best. Abel brought fat portions from firstborn of his flocks. Right? Cain's offering did not include a blood sacrifice. Did not include a blood sacrifice. Maybe a reason God rejected it, and of course Abel's did. How could Cain, since he was a farmer, how could he have provided a blood sacrifice?
Traded with Abel.
Traded with Abel, sure. Absolutely. Most Jews in Jerusalem in the first century didn't keep flocks. They lived in a big city. So how did they get their blood sacrifice? Bought it, right? I mean, we find Mary and Joseph buying 2 pigeons at the temple to offer the sacrifice prescribed in Leviticus. And that's where a lot of trouble came about, because you could only use temple money to buy those sacrifices. You remember why? Why wouldn't the temple...
Because it had the Roman emperor face on the coin.
Exactly. It was a graven image on that coin. That was reason number one.
The exchange rate wasn't bad.
Yeah, the exchange rate was the other reason. They were usurious in their exchange rate. So you had a biblical reason, and then you had a more practical economic reason for the trading of the money. In any case, so Cain certainly could have done that. But he didn't have a heart for God. How were they supposed to know? Right? I mean, ignorance of the law is no excuse. That's what we say here today. And I think the same applied here. Cain should have been knowledgeable about what was acceptable and what was not. Hebrews 9:22 gives us the answer. The writer to the Hebrews says, by faith, Abel offered up to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, God bearing witness in respect of his gifts. So, by faith, Abel offered up. That means to me that Abel was receptive to God's leading. You know, there's a lot more communication between people and God in this particular time frame. Abel was seeking to learn God's will. And God blessed his spirit with a measure of understanding. Cain, on the other hand, had a cold heart. Let's go on. Abel was a man of faith and knew instinctively what would please God. His focus was on the knowledge of good, not evil. Remember, we talked about the tree in the middle of the garden. It says, God said, you must not eat the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And we all think, well, that means that man immediately became evil and went downhill from there. Well, some did. But there was also instilled in us this thing called a conscience. We know the difference between good and evil. We know the difference between right and wrong. It's instinctive to us. Now, we can block those things out. We can harden our hearts and ignore it. But nevertheless, it's there. And so Abel knew what would please God. And Cain didn't really care. I mean, he was going to do it his way, not God's way. And God talking to him in first part of the 7th verse, it says, sin is crouching at your door, Cain. Sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must master it. Now, this is after his offering was rejected. And God says, there is more sin crouching at your door. You have to take steps to change it. I mean, God was trying to direct, he was trying to direct Cain in the right path. Nevertheless, Cain's response was anger. He was angry with God for not accepting his gift. You know, it's just like Adam, right? This woman that you gave me, God, gave me some of the fruit, and I ate it. It's your fault. And in the same way, Cain is kind of blaming God. He's not blaming himself, is he? His response was anger rather than contrition and a plea for forgiveness, a plea for guidance. God, please show me the right way, and I'll do it. Didn't even enter his mind. Didn't even think about it. And you notice God is more interested in Cain's heart than with the offering? It wasn't about the offering, was it? It really wasn't. It was about his heart and where he stood in his walk. So loving God was trying to steer Cain in the right direction, but he wouldn't go there. He wouldn't. And sin did indeed master him. You know, he wanted to take his anger out on God. You know, he wanted to shake his fist at God, kind of like Job did. Let me bring forth my argument, God. But he couldn't, right? He couldn't do anything to God, so he killed his brother instead. Now, that doesn't make a whole lot of logical sense, does it? But he did. Cain was an angry man. He was an angry man. Fits of temper. Then the Lord said to Cain, big question, where is your brother Abel? God knew where Abel was. When God asked Adam and Eve, where are you? Remember when they were hiding? God knew where they were. Very similar here. Many similarities here. Then God said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? I don't know, he replied. Am I my brother's keeper? Well, that was kind of a sarcastic remark, wasn't it? Why should I know? Not my turn to watch him. I use that line all the time. Somebody asks where Chris is. I don't know. I'm not turning to watch. Didn't check in with me. Am I my brother's keeper? Well, evidently he was. The Lord said, what have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. The shedding of innocent blood is horrific in God's sight. He says, the testimony of your brother's blood is crying out to me. And God gives Cain the chance to repent, not only of his hardness of heart in his offering, but also in killing his brother. He gives him a chance. He gives him chance after chance to do the right thing, repent, seek forgiveness. But the hardness of his heart was his undoing. He was always more concerned about the punishment than the crime. I mean, you see criminals, not just criminals, but you see people all the time that are very, very sorry they got caught, but not so sorry that they did whatever it was they did. They don't want to accept the consequences of bad decisions. We find it all the way back here in Genesis. There's nothing new under the sun. There's a passage in Matthew that I like that describes God's sorrow at being rejected by his creation. Matthew 23:37. Jesus is talking. He's looking out over the city of Jerusalem. And he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. But you were not willing. Or some translations say, but you would not. How often I've wanted to take you under my wings. And God is kind of saying that to Cain. Cain, I want to help you. But you would not. It's called free will, right? It's all part of God's purpose. Why are we here? Excellent question. People have been trying to answer that question for thousands of years. Why are we here? I think the answer is very simple. We're here to have a relationship with our Creator and worship Him. That's why we're here. And so we have his brother's blood as a testimony. And that takes us all the way to Revelation 6:10. We have those that have been killed, innocent lives, the souls of those. John tells us in Revelation, how long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood? Their blood, the martyrs, were crying out to God. Crying out to God. And so we have the blood of Abel crying out to God. From the beginning to the end, we find innocent blood always crying out to God. Now, the fate of Cain is to be a Bedouin wanderer. Right? He says that my punishment is more than I can bear. See, he's worried about the punishment. He's not worried about getting his heart right with God. He says, I'm not going to be able to grow anything. Whoever sees me is going to kill me. You're sending me out of your presence. I'm not going to live. I can't survive. I can't survive. And God takes pity on him. That's what's so puzzling to me. God takes pity on him. And he says, I'm going to put a mark on you that will advertise to any who finds you that they're not to kill you. I don't know. We don't know what the mark is. It's not described. Don't know if it was a birthmark like Gorbachev had, or a big G, God's person on his head. We don't know. But there was some mark that kept people from killing him. It said, anybody that finds me will kill me. What does that tell you about how man was progressing here from a moral standpoint? Going downhill fast. Then in verse 17 it says, Cain lay with his wife and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. Cain was then building a city to be named, and he named it after his son. And then we find some of the descendants of Cain, including the first bigamist. His name was Lamech. He had 2 wives. And then there were twins. There were Jabal and Jubal. Jabal and Jubal. Jabal was the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock, Bedouins again. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all who play the harp and flute. This is the first mention of musical instruments in the Bible. Harp and flute. We still have those today, don't we? Most of you know that my brother Lewis is an accomplished concert pianist. But in recent years, he decided that wasn't challenging enough, so he took Barbie Lou, his daughter's harp, from her because she wouldn't practice. And he has learned to play the harp. And he does a beautiful job. A beautiful job. I'm sure the quality of the instrument is a lot better today than it was 8,000 years ago, but nevertheless, it was the same principle. We have woodwinds, flutes, and strings. Somehow, God placed in our hearts a lot of things. We talked about a conscience. But he also placed in our hearts a love of beautiful things, including music. It's part of our DNA. It's part of who we are. Man will always find a way to make music. And I thank God for that. So, we find this, now we have the sin of murder. Cain is afraid he will be killed. So evidently that was a valid fear. Then we have a bigamist. Lamech has 2 wives. And we have this, and then Lamech says to his wives, I've killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times and Lamech 77 times, he said, you thought Cain was a bad guy. I'm really a bad guy. All right? Downhill slope. Sin stacking upon sin. We find a deterioration of the human race, or the descendants of Cain. By the way, the descendants of Cain disappear from history. Here. They disappear. There's no record of it here in the book of Genesis. There's a suggestion when we get over to Noah. We'll talk about that next week. But they disappear from history. Why is that? We're going to find the line of Seth is very detailed. The other son of Adam, one of the other sons of Adam, very detailed. The reason is because the generations of Seth, from the generations of Seth will come God's law, his people, and his son. See, the Bible is not intended to be a world history, a book detailing all the civilizations of the world. That's not its intention at all. Its intention is for us to see where we came from. And so it follows the line of Seth all the way to Abraham. And then from Abraham all the way to Jesus. That was the purpose. And he just kind of ignored what happened to Cain and his descendants. Now in Genesis 5:1, we have a retelling of creation. This is the 3rd time that creation, the story of creation, has been told. It says, when God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. He created them, plural, male and female. The time they were created, he blessed them and called them man. I think man began procreating almost immediately. Almost immediately. And it's just Cain, and the Cain and Abel story is there because of its significance, because of the lessons that we can learn. The 3rd retelling of the creation story, verses 1 and 2. Now there's some key verses between Adam and Noah. It says, when Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. Seth. Tradition says, after Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Tradition says 33 sons and 27 daughters, but there's no evidence to that effect. There's no evidence. I think it would be understandable that they would have a lot of children. I mean, what else are you going to do? Running around. No Fox News, no, you know. I don't know where that tradition came from, 33 and 27. Seth's son Enosh is an interesting character. He instituted public prayer and spiritual worship. If you go back to chapter 4, it's the last couple of verses. Adam lay with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth, saying, God has granted me another child in place of Abel, since Cain killed him. Seth also had a son, and he named him Enosh. At that time, men began to call on the name of the Lord. I think what he's saying here is the line of Seth began to call on the name of the Lord. Enosh. So we have here the first examples of public prayer and spiritual worship. There is hope through the descendants of Seth. However, most of Seth's descendants lived, had sons and daughters, and died. That's all we know about them. They lived, they had sons and daughters, and they died. I think they lived lives of quiet desperation, quite frankly. They didn't do anything special until we come to Enoch. Now, Enoch was the father of Methuselah, the oldest man recorded in the Bible. And Enoch walked with God, it says. Verse 22, Enoch walked with God 300 years and had other sons and daughters altogether. Enoch lived 365 years. Enoch walked with God, then he was no more, because God took him away. Here is one shining example in hundreds of years of a man who walked with God. And we don't know exactly how that manifested itself, but it says God took him away. He did not see death. An interesting part of the story. And then we find our old friend Noah. And we'll get into more detail about him, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. What does the word grace mean?
Unmerited favor.
Unmerited or undeserved favor. Undeserved favor. Mull on that a little bit. Okay, next week we'll pick it up with Noah and the flood. Prayer time.
Hey, David, I wanted to mention I went to an annual meeting of the Mountain Christian Churches, and they always had a bluegrass band, and there was a lady behind me talking to her friend, and she said, stringed instruments in the house of the Lord. And I thought the harp was one all the way back in the book of Genesis.
Yep.
Doug Hall is still in ICU, and they're still trying to figure out why his blood pressure is high, and he's still on an IV drip that's keeping the blood pressure down, but they've got to get him off of that and onto some type of oral medication to bring it down. And so that's the prayer right now. I've been gone for a couple days, but he was hemorrhaging some, and they said it would be okay because the blood should flow into the brain and be absorbed. But if that didn't stop, they would have to use some type of needle to go in and stop the bleeding. So even the next day or so is still critical for him. And I'll let Linda give you an update on Ben.
He's opted, instead of coming home, to go to rehab, which is a much better decision. He's still in pain, but he's moving. So he's coming along.
You're making progress, isn't it?
Okay.
Yeah. Good. And I know, you don't have to tell me, I know he's got a great attitude.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he can keep everybody laughing. So.
Yeah. That's great.
So Eloisa, and she's going to still have that surgery on her toe, but it's been put off for a little while. So she was hoping to be here today. I don't know what's going on with Jerry Beverly.
Nina got a note from Greg Hunt. Jill has breast cancer real bad, and he said that we finally got to go on vacation. He said not A real vacation, not like when you go stay with relatives. He says, a real vacation. He said, and I was almost going to cancel it because the financial burden that the treatments that Jill is taking and just all that. And he said, on almost the very hour that I was ready to pick up the phone and cancel the vacation, 3 things happened. I got a check out of the blue from someone saying, this is for you, have some fun. And then he got another check from another church that said basically the same thing. And a third check. This all happened within a 24-hour period. And he said the amazing thing about it is they all said, go on vacation, have a good time, spend time with your family. And he said, God answers prayers. And this has just been a wonderful, wonderful experience. Thank you all. He expressed his thanks to those who have supported them financially, but also, most of all, he says, thank you for your prayers. Thank you for your prayers. So,
Another thing about Ben's surgery that kind of threw us, because we had planned a summer trip, 6 weeks out on the road with a camper. Then the surgery came in, I said, well, there's a reason we're not supposed to go.